Start the recording. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series webinar today. My name is May Vang, and I'm with the Minnesota DNR Fish and Wildlife Outreach team. Welcome to the 194th episode. So, Woodpeckers in Minnesota. I'm really excited to share our guest today. So, her name is Dr. Elena West, and she's from the University of Minnesota. She's going to be speaking to you today about woodpecker species in Minnesota and also focus on the research that she does with the red-headed woodpeckers and speak about the red-headed woodpecker research and recovery project. So with that, Dr. Elena West, thank you for being here today. And again, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself and the wonderful work that you do.
Great. Well, thanks, May. Thanks to the folks at the Minnesota DNR for inviting me. I appreciate it. It's great to be here. Like May said, I'm Elena West. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Really excited to be with you today to share a little bit about woodpeckers and specifically the research that I've been doing for the last several years on red-headed woodpeckers. Mostly at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve in central Minnesota. I want to acknowledge that this is a collaborative effort with the University of Minnesota, Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, the Minnesota Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, and a number of other local bird organizations like the Land of Lakes Bird Alliance, the Red-headed Woodpecker Recovery Project, and we've received funding from the the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, as well as a number of other organizations. So just want to acknowledge that this work wouldn't be possible without generous support from those organizations and institutions. So just kind of kicking it off, just thinking about woodpeckers. Let's see if I can advance my slides here. Woodpeckers, if you don't know, they're a member of the Picidae family or the Picidae family. They're found all over the world, except in places where there are really like temperature extremes, like deserts and polar regions. We also don't find any woodpeckers in Australia, New Guinea, New Zealand, Madagascar, even though they could theoretically live in these places. Most woodpeckers aren't actually great flyers, or specifically like long distance flyers, and that makes getting to islands kind of difficult. So the fact that we don't see woodpeckers in these areas is probably because of that sort of lack of long distance dispersal ability. So I'm showing here on the right, this is a cladogram, and that just shows some of the relationships between different groups of woodpeckers and different drumming speeds and drumming lengths. And I'm not highlighting this research in particular here, but I like this, this diagram because it really shows the range of like sizes and shapes of different woodpeckers that we see throughout the world. And this is represented here in this photo that I'm showing on the left. These photos aren't to scale, but that sort of size differential is illustrated really well here. So we've got the bar-breasted piculet and the pileated woodpecker. So two really, really different species. The bar-breasted piculet is the smallest living woodpecker that we have in the world. Lives in South America. A typical adult is about only 3 inches long and weighs about 1/3 of an ounce. Whereas a pileated woodpecker, which some of you are probably a little bit more familiar with, they weigh, I think, closer to like maybe just under 1 pound or about 14 ounces, and they can be upwards of 18 inches long. So really, we've got this range of sizes and shapes across different woodpecker species, which is pretty neat. So woodpeckers come, like I said, in a variety of shapes and sizes, but they all have a number of things in common. They have pretty large heads with these really like straight, kind of long, pointed, chisel-like bills, which they use to flake bark, to get under bark on trees, and to peck into wood. They have pretty short legs and more stiff, longer tails that help them climb up the sides of trees and kind of hang on securely as they're doing their foraging. They also have what we call zygodactyl toes, which means that you've got 2 toes pointing forward and 2 pointing backward. And this arrangement really provides a strong like perch and grip and kind of allows them to maneuver in different directions on the tree to kind of suit that lifestyle that they have of climbing. Woodpeckers also have a number of really neat adaptations for foraging on tree trunks and for drumming, including these very long, sticky tongues. Sometimes they can also be barbed, and these help them extract food like insects and larvae from trees. Another anatomical adaptation of woodpeckers is that really long hyoid bone, which you can see in this middle diagram here. And this bone basically subdivides and passes on either side of the spinal column, and it wraps around their brain case before it ends in their nostril cavity. It plays a really important role, kind of acting as like a safety belt to protect their brain from damage that would incur otherwise from all of the drumming and the drilling that they do. So it's pretty neat adaptation. Woodpeckers are also one of the sort of few types of birds that excavates their own nest cavities. And so they need to be able to dig holes out of either dead or dying or even sometimes live wood or live trees. And that's not something that a lot of other birds can do. So pretty neat adaptation there. So jumping right in here in Minnesota, we have 9 woodpecker species that breed and or winter here in the state. So in our upper left, we've got a downy woodpecker. Next to that is a hairy woodpecker. They look very similar. Hairy woodpeckers have a much larger beak, however. I always like to say downies are dainty, hairies are huge to kind of help me remember those traits for those 2 species. Our large pileated woodpecker on the right there. In the middle row, we've got the northern flicker. In the middle of our little group of 9 here, we've got a red-bellied woodpecker, which this is the species that's probably most commonly confused with red-headed woodpeckers. They do have a red head, but it doesn't encompass their entire head. I also think that the red on red-bellied heads is a little bit more like flame red, whereas on a red-headed woodpecker, it's a little bit more crimson. On the right, we have a yellow-bellied sapsucker, which are indeed woodpeckers. And then we've got a black-backed woodpecker, a red-headed woodpecker, and an American three-toed. And those 2 on the bottom left and right, we see those species more in the sort of upper northern Minnesota and boreal regions. So among these species, the red-headed woodpecker, as probably a lot of you know, they're really the only species that's been in Minnesota that's been in pretty serious decline over the last several decades. They have a very large range across North America, sort of that eastern part of North America and into some parts of Canada. The breeding range I'm showing here in orange and purple, and the purple are just areas where they breed and winter. And these populations throughout North America have shown pretty widespread declines over the last 50 years or so. We see birds still quite commonly throughout the range, but populations appear to have declined such that you might only see one bird or perhaps a couple of birds rather than larger numbers, which was really much more common historically. In Minnesota, red-headed woodpeckers have experienced an average annual decline of about 6% since the late 1960s, and that represents a cumulative loss of about 95% of the population. So really big drop here in the state. This species has been designated a Minnesota species of greatest conservation need by the Minnesota DNR. And it's a target conservation species by Audubon, Minnesota. And these designations really give the species and species like them, special kind of attention and monitoring, and hopefully habitat restoration or other management efforts that we can put towards them to try to help bring some of these populations back. So we think that the loss in the Midwest, at least, is probably due largely to the loss of oak savanna habitat. In North America, oak savanna originally amounted to about 50 million acres from Texas all the way into southern Canada. And much of that habitat is gone in the Midwest, but since we know that that historic range of red-headed woodpeckers extends much beyond that original extent, we also know that they're not exclusively tied to oak savanna, but it's interesting that here in the Midwest, that was appears to be a really important habitat. Um, It's estimated here in Minnesota that there were 5.5 million acres of oak savanna, and that's pre-European settlement or pre-European colonization, I should say. And that represents about 10% of the state. So the DNR and land managers like the Nature Conservancy and other organizations estimate that less than 1% of that original acreage remains. And most of it is actually in these really small, kind of isolated blocks. So apparently in 1985, surveyors could only find 9 sites in the state with a meaningful blocks of oak savanna. And when I say meaningful, I mean something like between 35 and 500 acres. So not very large. It's a pretty low bar. And I have an asterisk here under at the word current because it's actually been kind of difficult to find updated information, and I'm working on it. But the data that I'm presenting here are actually from a 1986 study that looked at the historic and current extent of oak savanna. And so this was, 40 plus years ago. So we'll get there. So we know that in addition to oak savannas, red-headed woodpeckers, they breed in a pretty wide variety of habitats, including some habitats I'm showing here: deciduous woodlands, river bottoms, open woods. Sometimes we see them in parks or golf courses. I do get reports of them hanging out in people's backyards, sometimes in agricultural areas or along forest edges. And there's sort of a common theme here among these different types of habitats. And it's really this open understory and the presence of dead or dying trees. And you'll hear me say snag as well. And by that, I'm referring to dead trees or dying trees. And then in addition, you might actually also see a lot of live trees, like trees that produce masting fruit, like acorns and nuts. So this picture was actually taken at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, where I do a lot of my research. And you can see in the foreground, there are a lot of snags, and then in the background, you can see a lot of live trees. And oak savanna is really a transitional ecosystem. It's not quite forest, it's not quite prairie, or grassland. It's kind of this mix of both, or somewhere in between. It's really neat ecosystem. And this mixed habitat provides red-headed woodpeckers both with nesting and foraging habitat. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. But this species really likes to excavate their nest cavities in dead and dying trees. And that's a lot easier to do when trees are dying and are decayed. So, red-headed woodpeckers are also one of the few woodpecker species that forages for insects by fly catching. And so when I say that, I mean they sit on a limb, a low limb on a tree, and they fly out and they grab an insect that's flying by, or they drop to the ground and they find grasshoppers or insects near the ground, kind of like what flickers do. And this is a pretty unique strategy among woodpeckers. We think of woodpecker, and just like the name, we think that they drill holes into the sides of trees, but not all species do that, which is pretty interesting. So having that kind of open understory really allows this species to be able to fly catch a lot more easily and see insects. Another thing about ground foraging is that sometimes we see them near roadsides. And this turns out to be actually a pretty potentially significant impact in terms of mortality, because they like to forage for grasshoppers and other insects near the edges of roads, and then they sometimes get hit by cars. So it does appear to be potentially a non-significant component of mortality, or form of mortality in this species, at least here in Minnesota. So another common theme among the habitats where we find red-headed woodpeckers is ecological disturbance, which is really just an event that causes mortality to plants and to animals and kind of restructures the landscape a little bit in their spatial patterning. And this disturbance can come in many forms. Sometimes it's natural, sometimes it's fire, thinning of trees, flooding damage, disease outbreaks, grazing by cattle or bison. And we have a lot of evidence that red-headed woodpecker density is actually correlated with habitats that have recently been disturbed or are regularly disturbed, either by these natural processes or through managed efforts by humans. So in the case of fire as a disturbance, there's a lot of data that show that our national strategy of fire suppression that began in the early 1900s really has resulted in declines in a lot of birds that inhabit these kinds of habitats, these forested or woodland habitats that had regular natural fire throughout history. And these policies, they protect property, they protect humans, but at the same time, they threaten fire adapted plants and animals and ecosystems. So it's just something I wanted to address here. And fire really plays an important role in savannas by removing that shrubby undergrowth and renewing grassland species while leaving some of those hardier trees and also kind of speeding up that decay process of other like less hardy trees. So it's a really important component of these natural savanna and woodland ecosystems. So I mentioned there are these sort of fragmented patches of oak savanna throughout the state, but there are really only a handful of places where red-headed woodpeckers are known to breed in larger numbers. And when I say larger numbers, I mean maybe more than a handful of birds. So we're not talking about a lot of birds, of individual birds. We believe that there's a fairly large breeding population at Camp Ripley National Guard training facility near Little Falls. At the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, which I'm going to talk more about, we have a relatively and apparently stable breeding population that ranges from about 80 to maybe 100 or 110 adults every year during the breeding season. And then at Nearstrand Big Woods State Park, about 20 adults have been observed over the last several years, maybe the last 4 or 5 years, after some flooding happened there and kind of opened up some areas and created more dead snags and dead trees and habitat. So there's that natural disturbance. So red-headed woodpeckers are they're kind of this charismatic species, but they're actually sort of a challenge to study. And this might be why we don't know as much about them as we do some other woodpecker species, especially with respect to factors that kind of regulate their population. So they nest in tall snags or dead branches. They're really hard to find. They're really hard to monitor. These are, kind of inaccessible locations. You need a lot of time and special equipment to do this rigorously, to kind of collect that really important detailed information that we need. And then over the last 200 years or so, this species in particular has gone through these kind of boom and bust cycle fluctuations, where there's been periods of great abundance and then scarcity when they appeared to have been close to extinction. And it's been a little bit hard to tease apart, some of what some of the factors are that are driving that. Their movements during the non-breeding season or the winter, we think historically were driven by nut crops in these really, formerly extensive American beech forests, which we don't really have anymore. They've all been cut down. And today we have evidence that those non-breeding season movements are driven more, or they're associated at least with these sort of um, cyclic population fluctuations of acorns. So there could be kind of like this matching situation there. And so again, I think some of these reasons are why we don't know as much about their ecology and behavior. And these are really important things to know so that we can conserve them and work on habitat restoration. So, over the last several years, I've been conducting research at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve to try to address some of these more basic questions about their ecology and behavior. Cedar Creek is a 5,500 acre reserve. It's kind of more of a research facility and reserve through the University of Minnesota. It's a field station where scientists, students, and community members kind of work to identify sustainable solutions to environmental challenges, and this is one of them. Um, Amazingly, there just happens to be a relatively stable breeding and sometimes overwintering population of red-headed woodpeckers there that we can study, which is pretty neat. So I've been working here, as I said, for the last few years, and I've been working on identifying their habitat needs, just really basic. What are they selecting? What do they prefer? What helps them survive in terms of nesting and fledging success and adult survival? And then within that goal, kind of adding to our understanding of their ecology and behavior. And then the goal really is to use these findings to support habitat management and restoration efforts here in Minnesota, but then hopefully throughout the Midwest. So my research focus has largely been on understanding the components of oak savanna habitat that support nest site selection. So what are they choosing really on like a very micro scale? Like what kinds of trees, what are the characteristics of those trees that they're choosing? Nest success or nest survival. And by that I mean at least one nestling fledges the nest. How individual birds use habitat, fledgling survival, what factors on the landscape impact fledgling survival, and then also looking at behavior during the entire year. So not just during the breeding season, but also during migration and also during the wintering season, so that we can kind of tease apart all of these things about the species that are unique and potentially that can be used for management, for guiding management and making recommendations to land managers and private landowners and to try to create more habitat or restore habitat that we have. So this information that we're working on, I think will, like I mentioned, hopefully help us determine that specific information about habitat needs. And we're doing this throughout the full annual cycle because understanding how a species is doing during the breeding season is important, but also throughout the rest of the year. And this species is actually a facultative migrant. So they migrate some years and some years they don't. Some years they stay and they overwinter. So understanding some of that decision making and where they go when they do leave and what kind of habitat they select when they leave is another goal that we don't really understand. So we've started some of that work, and I'm not going to talk much about the results of that yet, but it's important to understand kind of that full season survival and habitat use and selection because it helps guide management efforts not only here but throughout in other areas where these birds are hanging out throughout other times of the year. So since about 2008, there's been a volunteer monitoring program, and I wanted to mention them because my work would really not be possible without the amazing help of a number of volunteers who come to Cedar Creek and help with identifying nests and monitoring nests throughout each season. These individuals spend hours and hours out in the field assisting with identification and monitoring of nests. I mentioned earlier that it can be really hard to find and monitor nests, and you need people on the landscape to help you do that, just to sort of observe a nest and say, we think we have birds that have created a nest, they're active, this nest is active, let's go check it to confirm. So the Red-Headed Woodpecker Recovery Project volunteers are individuals who started doing this in 2008 prior to me coming along and kind of formalizing the project, but many of them are still working at Cedar Creek and helping to monitor nests, and it's been really invaluable part of the research that we've been doing. And these volunteers also help with outreach and education. So some of you may have heard from some of them or seen them tabling at different events. And the eventual goal is to have these volunteers also help distribute information about, what we're finding at Cedar Creek. So we're very lucky, just kind of talking about our methods. We're very lucky at Cedar Creek. A lot of birds are actually habituated to coming to baited feeders. And so we can catch many of them by sort of slowly getting them used to feeders. They like peanuts, so we'll put peanuts on feeders near their nesting trees. And then that tends to kind of get them used to coming to these areas. And then we can put out a potter trap and catch them like this. And then we carefully extract them, and we kind of conduct a little, we do morphological measurements. We band birds, which these are color and metal bands, and we place them on leg future identification. So essentially each bird gets kind of a unique combination of colors so that they can be identified at an individual level, and we can track when we see them again. We can record that information that we know they're still alive, potentially from season to season or year to year, which is pretty neat. So I mentioned the nest monitoring work and how kind of hard that can be. So for that work, we use a nest camera that can be raised over 40 feet on a telescoping pole. And then we can place it into an active nest cavity to photograph what's inside. And this is really a key part of our nest monitoring work because it allows us to understand what's happening inside that cavity. Like I said, these birds are hard to study, and without looking inside a cavity, you really don't know what's going on. You'd have to kind of stand at a cavity for basically an entire field season or a breeding season to understand if that nest failed or fledged, and potentially how many nestlings left the nest and survived. So we get a lot of pictures like this, moving counterclockwise, starting with eggs, and then hatchlings, and then nestlings that are feathered and kind of ready to leave the nest. We do close to daily cavity checks throughout the breeding season to capture data on that brood size or the size of the clutch. Sometimes eggs will disappear, and we're trying to understand if that's due to predation or if that's adults removing eggs that are not going to survive. Nestling development is something we also look at, and then nest survival and fledgling survival as well, and knowing the number of fledglings that leave the nest. So these are all things that we do during our nest monitoring work. We have a pretty elaborate setup to access nest cavities, which is really the only way that we can actually go into the nest cavities and collect data on the cavities and the nestlings themselves, which we do very, very safely. I'm very thankful to have research technicians and volunteers who are willing to carry saws and heavy tools up on ladders, so that we can access some of the nestlings inside and kind of understand the cavities themselves. We do use all necessary safety precautions, but even despite this, it is certainly not for the faint of heart. We have to be really, really careful as we're doing this, and we don't create this setup on trees that we think are going to fall down. So we do assess all of the trees that we're going to extract additional information from. So I want to share some preliminary results with you. I haven't published much of this yet, but I think some of it's pretty compelling and might be interesting to folks who potentially have some oak savanna on their property or are thinking about, ways to get involved in habitat restoration efforts. So in terms of the nest site selection, so this is basically like what an animal chooses, where an animal chooses to nest, and you can look at this at many different levels, but we looked at a number of covariates that we believe might be important in predicting the sites that red-headed woodpeckers choose for nesting. So things like the number of live and dead trees on the landscape, whether the understory is most likely to be composed of woody or herbaceous vegetation, what the canopy is like around nest trees. Do you have a lot of canopy or not very much? This is a short list of the covariates we looked at. We do have more, but um, I'm not sharing all of them here because there's a lot of them. So our nest site selection results show that actually the density of dead trees or snags around nest trees is really important. This was the most important covariate that came out of our modeling. So the y-axis of our plot here, this is the expected value. This is the relative probability of use. So we're essentially looking at our plot showing a given relationship that says, as we increase X, how does that change the relative probability of a woodpecker using that tree for a nest site? So for dead trees, we interpret this statistically significant positive trend as the number of dead trees within 10 meters of a given tree. As that increases, the probability that the tree was used as a nest also increases. So that's pretty important, pretty exciting. It tells us with data, we kind of knew this anecdotally, but it gives us information with data that it is really, really important, that dead trees are really, really important. And so for the live tree plot, that's the one on the bottom, we would simply say that we don't see an effect of live trees within that 10-meter radius of each tree on that relative probability of use. And this is a relative probability because we're not able to calculate a baseline selection rate. We don't know the total number of trees at Cedar Creek that are used versus not used. That's why we're saying relative probability here. So we also calculated the odds ratio for the effect of dead trees on nest site selection. And ratios are basically a kind of a handy way to interpret our model. They tell us the likelihood of an event occurring. So a nest tree selected, that's our event that occurs in a treatment group, versus a control group, which is no dead trees added, and the treatment group would be dead trees added. So an odds ratio of 1 means no relationship, and a positive number means that adding dead trees increases the odds of a nest tree being selected. So here we have an odds ratio of 1.19. So that is the odds of a nest being selected increase by 19% if we add a single dead tree within 10 meters of our nest tree. And then if you add 4 dead trees, that doubles the odds. Adding 6 dead trees triples the odds of that nest tree being selected. So that's really, really interesting, really compelling, and I think starts to tell a little bit more of a story or a picture of the importance of dead trees in a landscape for this species in particular. We compared available dead trees near nest locations with trees that were used, and we looked at the bark softness. And so we found that actually, compared to available dead trees near nest locations, so these were trees that were not used, red-headed woodpeckers cavity trees showed much lower wood hardness towards the inner body of the cavity, but similar wood hardness near the outer sill of the cavity area. So that x-axis is essentially going from the outer edge of the cavity entrance, or where the bark is, to the inside of the cavity. So we can see a pretty big difference between trees that were not used or available trees and nest trees that were used, in that they really have to be pretty decayed. So nest trees tended to be much more decayed or a lot softer than other trees on the landscape that were not used. And so we were also interested from this in looking at sort of quantifying the proportion of dead wood on the landscape that meets the threshold of tree decay or softness that we found in our study. And so we were asking that question, and we found that only dead trees are good, only 13% of dead wood on the landscape is actually soft enough for nesting. And that's, if you think about decay in a tree, it's not probably uniform or linear. And so you can have some soft spots and some hard spots. And so that's probably what's driving that in part. I think that I wanted to share this because I think it's really compelling that emphasizes that wood decay, or that wood softness, I guess you could call it, is probably a limiting factor on the landscape. And so thinking about giving advice to people or advice to landowners, that best level of decay are the trees with the most decay relative to the others, but that's essentially the top 13% of the distribution. So it's pretty small, and it might be a factor in why we're not seeing as many birds, on the landscape, if there aren't enough sort of varying levels of decay. If we're removing trees from our land because we don't like the way they look, or we are, not we don't have open areas as well. So I think these are factors that are probably contributing to why we have such a decline in this species in the state. These are obviously preliminary results, but I thought they were really important to share and compelling, because I know that we get a lot of questions about, what can I do on my property, or what can I do on my landscape to help attract or bring birds, to my property. And I think this helps start telling that story a little bit more, that we probably need more landscapes with more decaying trees, and trees that are in varying levels of decay, because trees tend to fall down quite a bit in windstorms or during, different kinds of events. So having a varying level of sort of decay status on a landscape is probably really important, and that might just not be what we have enough of right now. So this is kind of the most of what I wanted to share with you today. I hope it's been helpful and interesting, and I am happy to take some questions now. I also want to mention that we do have, there's a lot of, Minnesota is a big state, and Cedar Creek is not necessarily the easiest place to get to. So coming to see these birds, there is a public trail, so you can come during the summer and walk that trail and potentially see red-headed woodpeckers if you're interested. But there's also a way to get involved on Zooniverse. We have a platform on this online volunteer citizen science platform called Zooniverse. It's Woodpecker Cavity Cam you can search for, and we have cameras that are mounted at a lot of our nest trees, and we're collecting additional information on behavior and kind of predators and the community of species that puts pressure on these cavities, because these cavities are really important for other species as well. And so we're trying to document that and learn more about what's happening at these cavities and in these oak savannas. And I think one of the staff at the DNR was going to put a link in the chat to that, but I'm also going to put it here. This is that top link. That's a Z link. You can write that down and join the project, and you can help us classify our images and our videos from this project and kind of get a sense for what it's like. It's really fun. And then, you can also help support us with a donation. All of this work takes a lot of funding and time, and we've really benefited from the support of the community in Minnesota and elsewhere. So anything helps this research. So with that, I can end, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. West. So we do have a couple questions in the Q&A, and that was really fascinating, like research and lots of really great information. The very first question is, has there been any new research for artificial nest boxes?
Not that I know of, like when I knew in terms of like last couple of years, nothing that I am aware of. Um, I know that there's some research that was done where they tried to attract birds to artificial nest boxes, and I don't think it was successful. We don't have data on why that might be. My sense from just being in the field and observing these birds and knowing a little bit about their biology, I think that, mating and the behavior that comes before nesting is actually really important. And males will select a tree, usually, we think, and excavate a cavity. And that's a process. And I think that, excavating the inside of it, I wish I had a photo of, I actually do have a photo, which, can you see that? Yeah. So, this is what the inside of a cavity looks like. It's kind of pear-shaped, it's very deep. This takes a lot of work. This is also, I think, why having that really soft, decayed wood is important, because you can't create something like this probably in a live tree. That would be really, really hard. And this is a cross section of a from a tree that fell down. Um, and so I think that the behavior of actually excavating, I think it's a part of the process of nesting. I think it's important. And I think without that, I've sort of wondered if some of that artificial nest box idea, like if that's a piece that's missing, because this is such an important part of that process, that if they can't do that, they're not interested, or they're just not going to do it. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. That's kind of my thinking, and I'm not an expert in animal behavior by any means, but that's sort of a thought that I've had about that.
Great. Yeah, it does seem like a lot of work as well to be able to do that. So, the next question is, how often does Cedar Creek do prescribed burns?
Yeah, so Cedar Creek actually has the longest running prescribed burn program in, I want to say, North America. It's been running since 1964, and they essentially have burn units, so very large blocks of land that are set up, and there are different prescriptions or different frequencies of burning that happen in those different blocks every year. And so sometimes it's some of those blocks are 9 out of 10 years are burned, or 1 out of 10 years are burned. And so what's really neat about that is that Cedar Creek has this long-term data set where they're studying how that impacts ecosystems, soil, tree growth, recruitment, community dynamics within that ecosystem. So it's an ongoing art and science, and they're really, really good at it. And they have an incredible amount of data that's come out of that work. There's a lot of it's been published, and it's available on Cedar Creek's website if you're interested in taking a look.
Okay. There was also a comment in regards to the nesting in the artificial nest boxes that
Yeah.
perhaps creating like an artificial or like a specialized faux dead tree, kind of like how people do it at a zoo, maybe that could have like the right kind of decay or softness in a certain part of the tree that might be attractive to a woodpecker as an idea.
Yeah, it's certainly possible to set up an array or some type of series of dead trees that have been taken from some other landscape and then placed uh, in a place where you can study that, where you can have that treatment against your control background sort of landscape. So that would be really interesting. Yeah.
That would. And
Mhm.
then I think you can go ahead and unshare your um, presentation unless there's a photo that you would like to share. And then in relation to the different tree cavities, the next question is, are there certain species of trees that are more likely to have the right kind of decay or softness when dead?
Yeah, I mean, trees certainly have their own sort of phenology of decay, right? And wood, physiology. So I'm not a tree expert, but the fire, at least among what we have at Cedar Creek, we have mostly northern pin oak and bur oak. And bur oaks are really resistant to fire. They're fire adapted, so they don't, when there are extreme fires or any kind of fire, they're not really damaged. But northern pin oaks are not. And so those tend to be the trees that we see red-headed woodpeckers nesting in, at least at Cedar Creek. But we know that throughout their range, they'll nest in conifer. Conifer, tends to have softer wood. And so that makes sense. Like down in the Carolinas and Florida, you see them nesting in conifer trees. Aspen also we see at Cedar Creek, sometimes birch or black cherry that's decaying. So I think the preference is probably not for species, but for level of decay. So as long as, I think that's where, we don't have to have oak savannas per se. I think it's really about savanna and it's about decay on the landscape. So I don't really think that it has to do with tree species as much as that level of decay and having enough different levels of decay of snags. And then, uh, that open understory as well.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see just different parts of the US if there are different studies on the different kinds of trees or
Mhm.
if it's just the open understory. And the next question is, do suet feeders help with this species?
Yeah, they love suet. They love feeders. They come to feeders. We have private land that abuts Cedar Creek, and they fly across the street all the time and find to people's feeders. So in the wintertime, suet is a really good option. Woodpeckers in general, if you're looking to attract woodpeckers, they love suet. Hmm.
Great. Let's see. Barry says, we saw a red-headed woodpecker down at Forestville State Park a few years back that is pretty heavily wooded, which doesn't seem ideal. Have you heard of them being down there?
Yeah, so I actually have a bioacoustics project that we're running. And Forestville was actually one of the sites where we detected red-headed woodpeckers with our acoustic monitoring devices. And one of my grad student actually has been down there a lot looking at the habitat. And it's interesting. I think it sounds like it is more heavily forested, but it's where they found this species was along an edge. And so nesting along an edge, but then having access to like an open area makes a lot of sense. So again, we see this variation in areas that they're selecting. I think as long as or the common theme that we're seeing is that they might nest in an area that's a little bit more forested or along an edge, but as long as there's an open area for fly catching and capturing insects, it might be okay. So that's something interesting about Forestville. Yeah. And even
Okay.
near Strand, I think, is a little bit more like that as well.
Great. In regards to kind of habitat and just where you are doing your study, Chris Ann, sorry, has a question about did you study or did your study find a correlation to woodpecker abundance with an increase in down trees, or did you just look at snags?
An increase in, we haven't looked at downed trees. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, we haven't looked at abundance and trees that have come down. Just snags.
Okay.
Yep, standing snags and live trees. Hmm.
Okay. And then the next one is, let's see. Jen says, I've seen red-headed woodpeckers around our acreage that has both varied types of trees as well as oak savanna. Recently, oak wilt has been identified in our woods, and we are unsure how to manage this for all birds and animals who utilize it for habitat. Any comments on that?
Yeah, we have oak wilt at Cedar Creek as well, and it's kind of moving east to west across the reserve. And interestingly, we're seeing I don't know if it's statistically significant, but we are seeing a sort of a pattern or a trend of birds moving east to west across the reserve in terms of nesting, so that where trees might be, where there might be greater instances of tree decay and death and falling down from oak wilt, then there's less nesting habitat, right? So um I don't have I would say there are researchers studying oak wilt at Cedar Creek, so you could reach out to Dr. Caitlin Barale Potter there. She's the associate director. She knows a lot more about what Cedar Creek is doing and related to oak wilt in particular. There's some suspicion that birds like woodpeckers might actually help transfer spores across because they move from tree to tree to tree. So I think oak wilt is, I think I don't know enough about it actually to provide any advice. So I'd suggest talking to some folks at Cedar Creek about or other, I think Three Rivers also might be working on that. But once a tree is dead and dying, I would say leave it standing for species like woodpeckers to use. But then you're also then balancing whether you know, that might help the spread too if you leave them standing. So again, I don't know enough about it.
Right. And speaking of just reusing or using tree cavity, so because we saw the shape of the tree cavity, but also how long it takes, Craig had a question about will this particular species of woodpecker, will they reuse the cavity a year to year for nesting?
Yeah, that's a great question. They do use, so this species has a really long nesting season. They often have two clutches. So they'll nest starting in May and kind of have that first brood fledge or fail by June, mid-June, and then be right back at it, sometimes in the same cavity, sometimes in the same tree. Um, there is a lot of reuse of cavities, and there's also a lot of reuse of trees. So sometimes it is from year to year. Usually the same cavity doesn't get reused from year to year, but within a male's territory, they're often using the same they're using the same tree or trees nearby within that same territory.
Okay. And then I think this is in regards to the preliminary results you shared, but the question is, from Matthew, is what do you suggest as a recommendation for the number of snags to have for attracting woodpeckers?
Yeah, so, if we're just talking real basic, you need one for the nest, right? But you might need, let's say you need two because maybe the first one isn't good enough or they don't like for some reason or it's not soft enough in certain areas, right? So I'd say, a minimum of a couple. And then the other thing that I actually didn't share, which I should have, but I will now, is that um, the females in this species actually don't do any of the nighttime brooding or sitting on eggs incubation. So males do all of that, and then females roost somewhere else, but usually within in the vicinity of the nest tree. So that gives you a sense, okay, so we need a couple of trees for the nesting area potentially, and then we need at least another couple of trees, probably for the female to roost. So I think you're probably talking about at least, a handful, if not more. And then looking at the odds ratio data where it just simply adding four more trees kind of doubles your odds of selection. I think that gives you a sense that you probably need a lot of snags. So I don't, I think that's good in a way because we can just start girdling a lot of trees or burning. If you have the ability to do that, or if land managers do, but it means it might be a little bit challenging too because you need so many.
Okay. Gosh, there are so many great questions out there, and I'm trying to get to all of them. But I'm trying my best. But the next question that I see is, at what age does the head turn a red color, and what is their lifespan?
We see when we handle juveniles or fledglings in their first year, we see sometimes red feathers on their head just in August or September. So they're starting to get those red feathers in their first year, and usually it takes until that first breeding season to fully come in. And then we have a record of a bird being, I think, 10, at least 10. I'm not sure what the Birds of the World through Cornell, what they have a record of, but it's somewhere close to that. So I'd say, upwards of maybe 8 to 9 or 10 years.
Okay. And then how long, Mary asked, how long do woodpeckers, so how long would they stay with their young?
Yeah, so interestingly, with this species at least, the juveniles, the fledglings spend about 3 or 4 weeks with them, and they'll often come back. If the cavity isn't being reused, they'll sometimes come back to that cavity and beg for food, which is really neat to see. And we see that on that Zooniverse camera data a lot. It's really neat. But then if those adults have a second clutch that they've started in maybe another cavity, they start getting really aggressive with those teenagers, let's call them, and really starting to push them away and be sort of aggressive with them to kind of go out on their own. So we start to see fledglings kind of taking longer distance movements from their natal sites, after about 3 or 4 weeks. And then they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then they usually disperse in September. Sometimes they stay over winter, but a lot of times they'll also disperse from that natal site.
Okay, great. So we just have time for one more question. And the question is, if we observe a red-headed woodpecker, is eBird a good way to report it?
Yeah, I think eBird's a great way to report it. Yeah,
Okay.
it's super helpful. And the location coordinates as close as you can get is also really helpful.
Perfect. Well,
Yeah.
again, I know there are lots of questions out there, lots of really great questions, lots of interest with woodpeckers and the research that you do. We are running out of time, unfortunately, but there are ways that they can also contact you as well. And then you can also contact us here at the DNR as well for that. Again, thank you again, Dr. West, for being here and sharing that amazing information and great information about woodpeckers and red-headed woodpeckers here in Minnesota. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Make sure that you register for our next episode, which is ice fishing with tip ups. It's the perfect time of the year to get out there to do some ice fishing. Next time, if you register, you'll join us to learn more about what to catch with the tip up, where and how to set it up, new regulations to be aware of, and tips to improve your catch. So please remember to register for next week. Have a great rest of your week. And as always, make sure to get some time outdoors and spend some time in the great outdoors. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.